Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. We're thrilled to see such a great crowd, and we're looking forward to a very interesting evening. I want to welcome you to the Robert A. Christie Lecture. This keynote presentation is part of the 2015 International Policy Conference. I'm Diane Zimmerman-Umbel. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences here at Millersville University, and it's really my pleasure to welcome you to the Robert A. Christie Lecture, named for a leader and an educator here at Millersville. He was appointed president of Millersville University in 1965, and Dr. Christie was a proponent of the liberal arts education throughout his presidency and also during his tenure when he oversaw the development of the East Campus here. In 1970, Dr. Christie and his family tragically died in a plane crash off the coast of British Honduras in South America, and the Robert A. Christie Lecture in Economics was established in 1980 with the cooperation of Mellon Bank in his honor and memory. So throughout the day today, many of you have attended sessions related to the ideas of happiness and well-being, and tonight's lecture seeks to build upon what you have been thinking about today by discussing the economics of happiness. Dr. Justin Wolfers is currently a professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan and is a visiting professor at the University of Sydney. Additionally, Dr. Wolfers serves as a research associate and fellow at a number of prominent research institutes, including the National Bureau of Economics, the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the Brookings Institute, and the Institute for Study of Labor in Bonn, Germany. Dr. Wolfers has held past appointments at Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Wharton School of University of Pennsylvania, and is a three-time winner of the Tough But Will Thank You in 5 Years award, a teaching award. He holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Sydney. Dr. Wolfers is known for making economics accessible to wide audiences, and he's a frequent contributor to the New York Times and has over 85,000 followers on his Twitter account. He was on Time Magazine's list of the best Twitter feeds of 2013, so you can check him out. In addition, Dr. Wolfers is a highly respected researcher in economics. His research interests are eclectic. He's published a wide variety of topics: subjective well-being, which is the focus of tonight's lecture, macroeconomics, family economics, labor markets, and political economy. In 2014, a poll conducted by the International Monetary Fund found that Dr. Wolfers was identified as one of the Generation Next 25 economists under 45 who will influence our understanding of the global economy for many years to come. So I invite Dr. Wolfers to the podium. We look forward to hearing from him, and then after his comments, we'll give you a few minutes to ask some questions. Dr. Wolfers, welcome.
The really fun things for me about being a happiness researcher is it's just such a rich interdisciplinary field. So for the students here, you take your economics class, and then you walk on over to statistics, and you go over to sociology, and then you go to psychology, and it seems like all these clowns are talking about very different things. And you've got 4 separate subjects that you keep in 4 separate books, and you keep them mentally very separate. The real world does not respect the boundaries of the departments that we artificially draw inside universities. And if we want to get any understanding of how to create a better economy and a better society, we need to be able to march through those walls as if they don't exist. And so that's very much the business I'm engaged in here. So it's very recent that economists have started to talk about happiness, and the reason that we do so, I'd like to tell you that it was a wonderful and deep philosophical debate in which we asked ourselves what the heck we're doing here. We looked long and hard in the mirror and decided we should care about happiness. The reason is in fact far more mundane. We only started measuring data on happiness recently, and now we've got a whole ton of data, and if you want to get economists excited about something, it's a whole ton of data. The good news is that today I have the results of literally hundreds of thousands of surveys asking people about their happiness all around the world. And so what I'm going to try and do is sort of summarize the big lessons that we think we're learning out of that. So as I said, I started as an economist, so we could start with the big philosophical question: what is happiness? What are we doing here? How does it all matter? But that's not really how economists work. I'm going to present you with data. So the big question really is, if I'm going to show you data on happiness, you've got to think about how can we measure happiness. And the way we do it is we use this incredibly simple technology. We ask people. So you run a survey and you ask them a question, and there are a range of different questions you might ask them. You could say, the very common question is you say, here is a ladder representing the ladder of life. Let's suppose the top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you. So I want you to imagine the best possible life, right? The bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. There are 10 rungs on the ladder. On which step of the ladder do you feel you are right now, right? And we can ask this question of hundreds of thousands of people all around the world. I would answer, I've had a terrific day, so I would say I'm on the 9th rung on this ladder. And when we ask this question around the world, we have to be very careful to translate it so it's exactly the right question. Actually, one of the interesting things, you would never have expected this, there are some countries that don't have ladders. So they have to ask them about the mountain of life instead, how far up the mountain they feel they are. Different surveys ask different questions. I could ask you, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life? Or I could say, taken all together, how would you say things are? Would you say that you're very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy? Then there's other questions that are... And so there is this question like, what is happiness, right? This is a sort of deep philosophical question. What is happiness? And if I'm just going to ask you if you're happy, happiness is whatever the heck you think it is. So I'm not going to take any strong theoretical position on this. You're happy if you tell me you're happy. You're satisfied if you tell me you're satisfied. And then we can go to these questions that ask at the daily level. Did you experience the following feeling during a lot of the day yesterday? Did you experience happiness, enjoyment, anger, sadness, stress, worry? Did you smile or laugh a lot yesterday? So there are all these different ways of measuring it. And they range from, the bottom one, the one I just told you about, says, how did you feel yesterday? And there are actually some when we say, how do you feel right now? And you'll see the first one asks you to think about how satisfied you are with your life as a whole. That's not really asking about right now, right? That's asking you to think about all of your experiences, where you are, where you've been, and where you're going. So these are somewhat different constructs, and different questions should be thought of differently, but we're going to mix them up a little bit because this is the data we have. So that's where the numbers are going to come from. And you might say, this doesn't make sense. If what I want to do is measure happiness, just asking people, I'm not sure I can trust what people say. So there's a whole industry of psychologists out there who have sort of validated these studies, validated these measures. So it turns out that if I ask you how happy you are, and then I go and ask one of your friends how happy you are, they're very highly correlated, closely related. If I ask you how happy you are, and then I put you in an MRI machine and they measure electrical activity in your brain, or if I measure your heart rate, or if I measure certain things about your eye, about how your eyes, it turns out they're also very closely related. If I take a photo of you and I take it to someone on the other side of the world who's in a completely different cultural context, and I say, how happy do you think this person is? It turns out they'll rate you as being about as happy as you rate yourself. So it turns out asking people how happy they are just isn't a crazy thing because it gives very similar measures to other approaches. And happiness also does the same thing. It reacts to things in a way that you think they might. People who are unemployed tell us they're less happy. That sort of makes sense, right? People who've recently been divorced tell us that they're less happy. People who are recently married tell us they're extremely happy. So these measures, no measure is perfect, and anytime anyone in any context is showing you data, they come from some sort of imperfect measure. But these are measures that I think do say something interesting. Let me pause for a moment on that. When I'm in front of a conference of economists say, oh, come on, this is just what people say. Real economists don't look at what people say. These are just answers to a survey. The people who say that actually forget something. The way we measure all of our economic statistics comes from surveys asking people about stuff. And it's exactly the same way. How do we measure the unemployment rate? We ask people. How do we measure gross domestic product? We ask people how much income they're earning. All of our economic statistics are in fact constructed by simply asking people. And so when I say these data are interesting, you could say they're flawed. I'm just going to say, that's fine, but I'm no worse than anyone else. So if you think I'm uninteresting, you think everyone else is really uninteresting too. So it's the least bad way forward. So the big question within economics for thinking about happiness is, what is the effect of money on happiness? Because, economists spend a lot of time focusing on income. You might think too much time. And, if income and happiness are not closely related, then that says my field has made a huge mistake and we need to fundamentally reinvent ourselves. Now, so what I want to do today is, all I'm going to do is show you evidence on the relationship between income and various forms of happiness. But there's no such thing as one relationship between income and happiness. There's lots of different relationships. One thing I could do is I could take everyone in the United States and I could say, within the United States, are rich people happier than poor people? A different thing I could do is I could say, what about between countries? If I compare the United States to Burundi, which is poor, are rich countries happier than poor countries? Or I could say, as countries get richer, do they get happier? Or I could say, are those countries that get the richest the fastest getting the happiest the fastest? So these are all different relationships and we measure them in different ways. I'm going to show you evidence on all four. But I walk into this question with, there's been a lot of prior work on this, and there's a very commonly held view called the Easterlin paradox. And it's called the Easterlin paradox because of Richard Easterlin, an economics researcher in the 1970s, who claimed that there was a real puzzle in the happiness income data. When he looked within a country at a point in time, like the United States, he found that rich people were happier than poor people. But when he looked across countries, he failed to find any evidence that rich countries were happier than poor countries. And as he followed the United States through time, as it got richer, he failed to find any evidence that it got happier. So that seems a paradox, right? Sometimes more income seems to make rich people happier than poor people, but it doesn't make rich countries happier than poor countries. So what's going on? So Easterlin proposed a theory that would explain this. His theory is that what matters is how rich you are compared to other people. And so if it's all about keeping up with the Joneses, that would explain why, if you're richer than your neighbor, you'd be happier than your neighbor. So rich people in the United States would be happier. But if you're only comparing yourself to people who live in the same country, then there's no reason to think that a rich country, in which, you're richer, but so is your neighbor. And so therefore you're no better off. So that would suggest that a rich country is not going to be happier than a poor country. And if what matters is how rich you are relative to the Joneses, as a country gets richer through time, you're going to get richer, but so are the Joneses. So therefore neither of us is going to get happier. So that's a story that could reconcile this set of facts. So this has become a very, very widely held view. And this is the claim that relative income is what determines happiness. Now, I want to suggest to you, subtly, this is exactly wrong. And it's not a theoretical argument. The argument is going to be the facts that Richard Easterlin thought he knew just turned out to be wrong. Okay, so let's fast forward to what I think of as being, Betsy and I should mention, by the way, all of this work is joint work with my co-author, who's also my better half. So it's a very intense household. And all we do is talk about economics. But we think, and what I'm going to show you today is to show you that the data that Easterlin found puzzling, he was just misreading. So my claim is, I agree with him. Rich people within a country at a point in time are happier than poor people. But I think he's dead wrong when he says rich countries aren't happier than poor countries. I'm going to show you that rich countries are enormously happier than poor countries. And when he said that he couldn't find evidence that as countries got richer, they got happier, I'm going to show you that he was dead wrong about that. As countries have gotten richer, their people have gotten happier. And I'm also going to show you that those countries that got richest the fastest also got the biggest bump in happiness. So I'm going to show you 4 sets of facts here. And so when you figure this out, that no matter which way you look at the data, income and happiness are incredibly closely related, there's no paradox here. The world might even be as simple as economists think, which is to say that rising levels of income, rising opportunities, and rising economic development can be among the most powerful forces raising well-being. So let me be clear about 2 things. The first is what the form of the argument is. There's no part of me that is going to give you a theory about happiness. I have no theories. I'm not very good at theories. I don't have a view about what happiness is. What I'm doing is constructing a purely empirical argument. I'm saying if you want to have a theory, Easterlin has one, it's based on a set of facts, you should make sure those facts are right. And so I'm simply going to say, here's the right way of looking at the facts, let's let the data speak, and we'll find that income and happiness are closely related. You may or may not like that, that may or may not agree with how you view the world, but they're facts, and we're going to have to grapple with facts. The second thing I should be very clear about is the form of the argument again, which is you might be puzzled, like, oh, one researcher thinks one thing, another researcher thinks another thing, I don't know what to do about all of this. So let me be very clear about how that works. When Easterlin looked for evidence, he looked to see, are rich countries happier than poor countries? He failed to find evidence that that's true. He didn't have a lot of data. We call that an absence of evidence. He failed to find evidence that rich countries are happier than poor countries. But that doesn't mean rich countries are not happier than poor countries, it just means he didn't have evidence for the proposition. We shouldn't confuse the absence of evidence for something as being evidence of its absence. If you've only got a small amount of data and a few countries, it can be really hard to find a pattern that's actually there if you have a large number of countries and a large amount of data. And that's really what the story here, which is because Gallup has now been collecting data in 140 countries around the world, you'll see some very clear pictures. But those pictures wouldn't be so clear if you only had data from half a dozen countries. And so it would be wrong to say when I've got data from only half a dozen countries, I know that rich countries aren't happier than poor countries when I can't find that they're correlated. The right thing to say is when I don't have a lot of data, it's just really hard to know. And so that's sort of the story that's going to reconcile the old view with the new view. So this 4 ways of thinking about the income-happiness relationship, that's sort of the structure of the talk. Okay, and so now the rest of my job is to bore you into submission by showing you tons of data, right? And all of it's going to be about the relationship between income and happiness. But remember, there's 4 relationships, right? There's the within country at a point in time, there's the between country, there's the comparisons as a country gets richer, and there's the comparisons as which country gets richer, which ones are going to get happiest fastest. And so what I'm going to start by doing is showing you the relationship between income and happiness within a particular society at a point in time. Let's start with one of our favorite societies, the United States. So this is a survey called the General Social Survey, and they asked the question, taken all together, how would you say things are these days? If you're in the bottom 10 percentile of the income distribution, you're about, Americans are an optimistic bunch. There's about 21% of people say that they're very happy. You move up to sort of middle class incomes, 25% say that they're very happy. You move to the upper middle class, households earning between 50 and 150,000 a year, 40% say they're happy. And you move up to the top 10% of the income distribution, and you find that 53% of people say they're very happy. It seems, if you want to be very happy, it's a much better idea to be born in the top 10% than to be born in the bottom 10%. And let's go to the other end of the happiness distribution. Let's look at how many people are unhappy. So these are people who, for some reason it's impolite to say I'm unhappy, so they say I'm not too happy, right? Yeah. So, interestingly, those with the lowest incomes, over a quarter of them are willing to say they're not too happy. By the time we get to the top of the income distribution, only 2% are in that category. So we could almost eliminate unhappiness by being born in a household where mum and dad earn a ton of money. So that seems like it's a very, very strong relationship between income and happiness. And so what I've done, I have data like this for every country around the world. So I could show you this table, 140 more versions of this table, one for every country. And it would take a long time, right? So instead, I'm going to now consolidate a whole bunch of my data into a single chart. So I'm going to take the 25 largest countries in the world, and so this represents over 90% of the world's population. And for each of them, I'm going to let my computer tell me what the relationship is between annual household income in thousands of dollars on the horizontal axis and how satisfied you are on a 1 to 10 scale on the vertical axis. And one of the things to be clear about is I have to think about how I can compare Mexican pesos to US dollars. And so all of these comparisons take account of the different cost of living in different countries and the different exchange rates and different currencies that are being used. And so what you see is in every one of these countries, as families get richer, people within them seem to get happier. And that shape has sort of a curve look to it, right? So it looks like a few extra dollars when you're earning, say, $10,000 to $20,000, a few extra thousand makes a pretty big difference. You start to move up the happiness curve pretty quickly. And then beyond that, it starts to flatten out a bit. So extra money matters, but it doesn't matter a lot. Now, one thing to realize is none of those curves ever flatten out completely, right? So extra money still continues to matter. So some people say, oh, money matters, but it only matters up to a point. That's sort of half true, which is it matters less and less the more you have. But there's no point at which you're like, you know what, I got enough, no more is going to make me happy. It never fully flattens out. Now, this is a relationship, I'm showing you the relationship with the raw data, and just to be clear, I haven't told my computer what the functional form or the shape of those curves should be. My computer is just sort of taking a running average as it's going through the data. Okay, and so this graph summarizes responses from about 500,000 people. So it's not that everyone's on the curve, they're all over the shop, but this is what the average looks like. So when an economist sees a graph like this, he immediately thinks there's something, what I want to do is rescale the horizontal axis. Because this is sort of going up and then it starts to diminish. It looks like, if you remember your high school math, it looks like a log function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change only how I draw the horizontal axis. So for those of you who like math, this is what we call a log scale. For those of you who don't, let me simply point out that as we move along now, each extra 6 inches that you move along on this graph, income is doubling, right? And so now, now look what happens to these graphs. So the first thing is in every one of these 25 countries, these graphs are upward sloping. So that just says, higher your income, more income, more happiness, right? The second thing you see is now that we're drawing it on a log scale, these all look like straight lines. They look like straight lines in just about every country. And I know it's hard, no one's used to thinking in terms of logs except economists. So let me tell you what that means. The fact that it's a straight line means that in every one of these countries and at every income level, a 10% rise in income buys round about the same increase in happiness. Okay? So obviously in the United States, to raise income by 10% takes a whole lot more money than it takes to raise income by 10% in Burundi. So this still says each additional dollar buys you diminishing benefits, but each percentage change has about the same impact. The thing that I think is amazing about this graph, and like, maybe I'm an optimist, maybe it just looks like multicolored spaghetti to you, but to me, when I squint at it, I'm looking at data from 25 very different countries at 25 different levels of economic development, asked in a variety of different questions, and I'm stunned at how similar these graphs are. Each one of those lines is pretty much a straight line, and in each and every case, the slope looks remarkably similar. I want to talk for a moment about the slope. The slope of this line describes how much extra happiness on a 1 to 10 scale is created every time we raise income by a certain, by 100%. So that income happiness slope, it's remarkably similar across each of these countries. In fact, that income happiness slope, I'm going to call it beta. The reason I call it beta is it's a Greek letter which makes me sound smart. That slope is round about 0.35. We won't talk for now about what the 0.35 means, but I want you to remember that number because all the other times I'm going to show you the relationship between income and happiness, we're going to discover that the slope is awfully close to 0.35. Okay? So, as I said, some people look at these data and they're like, oh, come on, there must be some point beyond which all your needs have been met. So therefore you don't need more money, and more money is not going to create more happiness. This is a very common view. So I went looking for evidence that this is true. Now, you can look at this graph. You see no evidence in any country that this line suddenly becomes flat, right? So even once, people, for instance, thought, well, once your basic needs have been met, say when your income is $10,000, any extra money is just not really worth it. You don't really need it to be happy. And that, if that were true, the line would become flat. right? More income wouldn't buy more happiness. But it looks to me that even in the very richest countries of the world, and even among the very richest people in the richest countries of the world, the line keeps pointing up, which is to say, even among the richest people on the globe, more income seems to be related to more happiness. Now, the problem with this data is it only shows incomes up to $128,000, and I know that some of you in this room are particularly ambitious and hope to earn a lot more than that. And so you might be interested in what the income-happiness relationship looks like if you end up being extremely rich. And it turns out that's very hard to do, because what I'm going to need is a survey that asks a whole bunch of rich people about their happiness. And the thing is, when we ask surveys, we often ask people their income, but we don't ask, we sort of say, do you earn more than $50,000? And we sort of think it's rude to ask beyond that. So there aren't a lot of surveys that ask people, are you super rich? And how happy are you? But I found one. It's actually an interesting survey. It's a little Gallup survey. It's a survey of 1,000 people, which they ask two questions. One is, how happy are you? That's shown in panel A. And the other is, how satisfied are you with your life? That's shown in panel B. And you'll see that the proportion of people who say that they're very happy among the poor is only 35%, and it rises to 42%, then 43%, then 55%, then 46, then up to 55, then up to 60, then up to 60, then up to 70, then up to 83. And then I find that people earning $500,000 a year, they're all happy. If you want to eliminate unhappiness, make everyone rich. It's kind of a striking finding, 100%. So people have this view. A lot of people come to these data with a prior. They say, in fact, I have a colleague who wrote a book called The Paradox of Happy Peasants and Miserable Millionaires. And she thought that there was lots of happy peasants and lots of the book's called Happy Peasants and Miserable Millionaires. I just went and surveyed them. I couldn't find a miserable millionaire. There wasn't one. And so we have this view that people with more money, they must still have a whole bunch of problems and it gets in the way. But it turns out that's not quite right. Now, let me show you something else that's remarkable. Once you're earning incomes above 100,000, no one's unhappy. And no one's unsatisfied. Now, I want to admit something at this point. The problem with my survey is I would survey 1,000 Americans, but actually that's not 1,000 rich people, right? Most of the people I survey turn out to be middle class. And so when I say 100% of people earning more than $500,000 are very happy and very satisfied, I should admit I surveyed exactly 8 of them. So this is not the most robust finding in the world, but it is still true that when researchers, I can definitely make the following statement. When researchers have gone looking for miserable millionaires, we can't find them. So it turns out that the relationship between income and happiness, if you thought that all you needed was $10,000 a year to meet your basic needs, or $50,000 or $100,000, it turns out all the way up the income distribution, the people earning 200 are happier than the people earning 100, the people earning 500 are happier than the people earning 200. So there's no evidence that this relationship becomes weaker at some point. So what I've done so far is, remember I said what I was going to do was I was going to talk about the relationship between income and happiness. And I'm going to begin by comparing rich people and poor people. And so that's what we've done so far. We've compared rich people and poor people within the United States, and we've compared rich people and poor people within the 25 largest countries around the world. And in the privacy of my own home, I've done this with another 115 countries, and in every single one, rich people are happier than poor people. Okay, that's not actually that surprising. Everyone sort of agreed with that. What about this second question, what happens between countries? Are rich countries happier than poor countries? Here's the data. The thing that I can do that no other earlier researchers were able to do is I can show you data here from 140 countries around the world. What I'm showing you is on the horizontal axis for the econ students is real gross domestic product per capita adjusted for purchasing power parity. And if you didn't understand that, you should do another economics class. But what that really is average income. Okay, gross domestic product is a total earnings, total income of the economy. Per capita means divided by the number of people, so then we've got average income. And when I say average income at purchasing power parity, that just means adjusting for the different costs of living in different countries. So for every country, what I've done is I looked up the average income, and then I figured out for people in that country what was the average level of happiness. Okay, so you can see, for instance, one of this down at the bottom here, we can see SLA, is that Slovenia? No, that's not Slovenia. We can see, certainly we can see Afghanistan. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. And people in Afghanistan, when you ask them, tell you that they rate their lives a 4 out of 10 on average. We can move all the way up to the United States. In the United States, we tend to rate ourselves around about an 8 out of 10 on average. And we see this when I look at this graph, I see a very, very clear relationship between income and happiness. Very clear evidence that rich countries are happier than poor countries. So what I've done to make this easier on your eye is I've drawn the black dashed line. That's a regression line, which is to say it's a line of best fit, showing you what the computer thinks the relationship between these two are. The correlation between income and happiness is 0.82. If you've taken a statistics class, that means a lot to you and you're really impressed. And if you haven't, let me simply say that in the lifetime of looking at comparisons across a whole bunch of different stuff, across a whole bunch of different countries, that's an extraordinarily high correlation. And so when people say there's no evidence that rich countries are happier than poor countries, this seems to me to be very compelling evidence that in fact people in rich countries tell me they're much happier than people in poor countries. Now, one thing you might be concerned about is, well, is it really the same thing to survey people in the United States and to survey people in Burundi? They speak different languages. The cultural meaning of happiness might be different. The survey may not have been well translated. Maybe we can't really compare those data. If that's true, that's a totally legitimate criticism. But whenever you make a statistical objection, you need to follow it through to its implications. And the implications of that concern, that these surveys are not comparable, are actually, this graph is more remarkable. Because what I'm showing you is my measure of happiness is closely related to income. And if you're concerned that these measures aren't truly comparable, you're concerned that my measure of happiness is not a good measure of happiness. And so these are correlated, they're tightly related despite that. And the only way that would be possible would be if the true relationship between income and happiness is super strong, and it still comes out when we have messy measures, because the messy measures just make that relationship look a little messier. So it could be the relationship between income and happiness, if anything, I might be understating it. Now remember where I was comparing rich and poor people within a country at a point in time, I said there was this beta, the slope. How much extra happiness does extra income buy you? And it turns out when you compare rich and poor people, that beta was 0.35. It turns out when you compare rich and poor countries, that beta, that slope, is also about 0.35. It's not exactly 0.35, but it's near enough for me to call it, for an economist to be impressed that it's close to 0.35. So that tells us there's no paradox here. The relationship we see between income and happiness is roughly the same when you're comparing rich and poor people as when you're comparing rich and poor countries. So you might say, oh, just one graph, that's not that interesting, it's just one data set, I'm not impressed. So here's an attempt to go back and show you all the graphs from all the data that any researcher could have analysed. So remember I said, in the olden days, Easterlin thought that rich countries were no happier than poor countries. And I wanted to be clear about that, which is he failed to find evidence that rich countries are happier than poor countries. And here's the data that was available to him in the 1970s. There was 5 different surveys of there was 5 different surveys that went across countries asking people how happy they are. So the one in the top left is when Gallup went out and they asked people in 5 different countries how happy they were, and you can look at how the average income in that country. And then there's 4 other surveys like this. So what Easterlin did is he drew graphs that looked a lot like this. And do you see there's a light grey band on each graph? He sort of said, look, most countries, their levels of happiness are pretty much inside the grey band. So their levels of happiness are pretty similar. So even when I have rich and poor countries, their happiness levels are pretty similar. So that's him failing to find evidence that rich countries are happier than poor countries. There's a different way of doing this, which is instead you look at the relationship between income and happiness. And the dashed line in each of these 5 plots shows you what that correlation is. And in each case you find that while the relationships aren't obvious and they're not clean and they're a little hard to find, it looks like in each case rich countries are happier than poor countries. So in fact, what he found was he had data that showed that rich countries are happier than poor countries, but because there wasn't enough data for it to appear to be statistically significant, it's a statistically insignificant finding. But it's wrong to say because something's statistically insignificant that it doesn't exist. That's what I meant when I said he confused an absence of evidence as being evidence of absence. Just because a researcher can't find a statistically significant effect doesn't mean that with a bigger data set it wouldn't occur. So then we can go forward to the World Values Survey, which is another big cross-national study, and they ran different waves each decade. And you can see that I'm showing the same graph, which is average income on the horizontal axis within each country, and average life satisfaction on the vertical axis. And in each of these waves, you can see as we get more and more data, it becomes increasingly clear that rich countries are happier than poor countries. Now, if the only data you had was the first wave of data from the 1980s, do you see that we didn't have a lot of data back then? It's because most of the surveys of happiness just went to the industrialized countries. And so most of our data came from rich countries. Now, if you want to say, are rich countries happier than poor countries, you've got to have rich countries and poor countries. And so the problem was, it was very hard to see the relationship because we're mostly comparing rich countries with other rich countries. But as we started to add more poor countries to the data, and that's what happens through time, you see we get more data in the lower left. See, these are poor countries that are also unhappy. We see that it's very clear that rich countries are happier than poor countries. There's another recent survey that was run by Pew called the Global Attitude Survey. And you can see again, this now is only 44 countries, but 44 is still more than we used to have. And you can see again that rich countries were happier than poor countries. And the relationship again looks like that beta is around about 0.35. And this is the chart I already showed you. So what I've just shown you is the last few charts have given you an intellectual history of how we've learned about this relationship through time. As we went and surveyed more countries, we got more data, we learned more, and it became increasingly clear until now we have 140 countries. Now we have data from 140 countries. I think it's quite clear rich countries are happier than poor countries. Okay, that's the second relationship between income and happiness. The first one was between rich and poor people within a country. The second one is between rich countries and poor countries. And the third one is going to be about what happens through time. As a country gets richer, do people get happier? Because if the answer is no, then that suggests that economic growth is a bad idea, right? If economic growth doesn't make any of us happier, what's the point of it? In which case we're doing economics wrong. The answer, of course, turns out to be yes, that as countries get richer, they get happier. The idea that economists have had of promoting economic growth isn't crazy. Now, the difficulty with this is if I want to think about what happens through time as a country gets richer, I'm going to need data on happiness through time in a whole bunch of countries. And the problem is we've only been measuring happiness for a few years now. So there's only a small number of countries where I actually get to see what's happened to happiness through time. So this is when I move from like having really good, really big data sets to telling stories with case studies, but that's because it's the best we got. So let me start with, so the specific claim Richard Easterlin had made was that income growth in a society does not increase happiness. As we'll see, I don't think that claim was quite right. So here's how he made the claim. He looked at three groups of countries. The first is Japan. Japan is actually incredibly interesting and incredibly important because Japan was the only one of these countries where the government has been systematically collecting happiness data for decades and decades. In fact, the Japanese government had been collecting happiness data through the entire post-war period. And this is a period in which Japanese average incomes had doubled and then doubled again, and then doubled again. So if you can double income 3 times, you've got to figure that if income makes you happy, the Japanese are going to be a whole lot happier at the end of post-war reconstruction than they were earlier. I'm showing you Easterlin's plot here, and it looks like it's a flat line. So this is kind of embarrassing to me, because it says as Japan got enormously richer, nothing happened to happiness. Now, there is this one little thing he's doing. So if you ever want to make a line look like it's really flat, what you do in Excel is you stretch out the axes so far apart that it makes it look like any line is flat, right? And if instead you zoom in, then we'll get a closer snapshot about what's going on. That's not actually the whole story, though. The second one, and a particularly interesting one for many of us, is the United States. We have data on happiness in the United States since 1972. This is showing it as Easterlin saw it at the time he wrote. And it appears that as we've experienced economic growth in the United States over the past 3 or 4 decades, Americans on average haven't gotten any happier. That's also embarrassing for my story. And then the third plot is the European Union actually surveys its public twice a year asking them how happy they are. And so this is data from the 9 countries that were actually in the EU at the beginning. And when Easterlin stares at this, he says, well, it looks like some countries go up, some countries go down. So rising incomes in Europe cause some to get happier, some not to get happier, and some to get less happy. Boy, I call that a mess. It doesn't really look like rising income delivered rising happiness in Europe. So now what I'm going to do is sort of go through these data, and I'm going to do it in like really boring detail, because the importance of getting statistics right is sometimes the devil truly is in the detail, and show you the right way to draw inferences from these data, what I think is the right way. Here's the problem with Japan. Actually, let me turn that off for a minute. So remember I showed you the plot? It looked like through time, the Japanese hadn't gotten any happier. So I downloaded the Japanese data because I wanted to look at it. I thought it was really interesting. It turns out the problem is the code book was in Japanese. I don't speak Japanese. And I was in Munich at the time. I was working, and so I realized Google Translate could help me. So I put the code book into Google Translate, and it told me what the question was. And then I took the survey form from another year and I put that into Google Translate, and I discovered Google Translate was telling me it was a different question. And I thought, what's going on? So then I hired actually it was a Penn undergraduate who was a Japanese major, and I said, you've got to translate these things. Google tells me they're different, but if you want to find out what's going on through time, you've got to keep asking the same question. And it turns out what no one had realized is the Japanese government every few years would change which question they were asking. And it turns out that people's answers to questions about happiness are incredibly dependent on precisely how you ask the question. And so very small changes in survey methodology have very big differences. So now let me show you the Japanese data. What I'm showing you here is, on the horizontal axis again, average income in Japan, and on the vertical axis, average levels of well-being. And what happened from 1958 through to 1963 is they were asking one question. It was, how do you feel about your circumstances at home? The answer is satisfied, not satisfied, somewhat dissatisfied, extremely dissatisfied. So as Japan grew through this period, and something like 18% of people were willing to say that they were satisfied, right? So that top category, quite a few people were willing to say. And through this period, this is the green dots on this plot, as Japan got richer, more people were saying that they were satisfied. And so those dots go up, right? So that looks like rising incomes related to rising happiness. They made one small change. The next year, the question is, how do you feel about your life at home? Completely satisfied, satisfied, and so on. There's a big difference between being satisfied with your life and being completely satisfied with your life. And in fact, the exact Japanese translation of this is actually totally absurd. It's something like, overall things are absolutely spectacular, right? And so when you change the top category, this is real simple, real boring stuff, but if you change the top category from being satisfied, 18% of people said they were satisfied, to completely satisfied, 2% of people said they were completely satisfied. And if you don't take account of that, it looks like the number of people who say that they're in the top category of happiness fell. So it looks like we had a massive happiness recession. No such thing occurred. All that happened was they changed the question they were asking. And so that's why after the first, when we moved from the green dots to the blue dots, looks like the measured level of happiness fell, but what changed was the survey. Then they kept asking that same question and Japan kept growing. And you see as Japan kept growing, the blue dots go up. Japanese kept getting happier as they kept getting richer. And then they changed the question again. It used to be they asked about how do you feel about your life at home. Now they ask how do you feel about your life. It turns out people like their life at home. Your boss is not at home. But when I ask about your life, you feel less happy. And so what you see is when they change the question, we move from the blue dots to the red dots now are lower again. Looks like happiness fell, but in fact it didn't, they changed the question. So then we get a bunch of years where Japan's income doubles again, rising income, the red dots rise, and so does rising happiness. So we've got 3 long periods of Japanese economic growth when income doubled and then doubled again. And throughout that entire period, rising incomes led to rising happiness, except the times they changed the survey questions. Then something happened in the 90s. 2 things happened. They changed the survey question again, and the Japanese economy plummeted. So this is called the lost decade. Japan had never had unemployment before. The Japanese economy, if you remember in the 80s, we all used to say, you've got to study Japan. Japan's the future. We were all gung-ho about Japan. And then Japan hit what was called the lost decade. which is a very generous term for a lost 3 decades. But basically the Japanese economy has not grown since. And that's why did you see the fourth panel here? It's incredibly short. That's because the Japanese economy, its average income today, is not much higher than it was many, many years ago. And so through that period, Japan now actually has an unemployment problem that was basically unknown in Japan prior to that. Happiness finally plummets. Okay? So in that period, there's no economic growth, and in fact, declining happiness. Now, if you look in the 3 left panels, the rising happiness is associated with rising income, again with a slope that's around about 0.35. Pretty much what I was expecting. So that was Japan. Let's go to Europe. So what I'm going to do is show you data from the 9 European countries that were there at the beginning of the EU, and these are also 9 of the large ones. And for each of them, what I'm doing is showing you, and I apologize, some of the font is so unreadably small, even an economist should be embarrassed. But on the horizontal axis, I'm showing you average income, and on the vertical axis, I'm showing you well-being. And so in 8 of those 9 cases, you see an upward sloping relationship, which is to say in 8 of those 9 countries, as they got richer, they got happier. And there's one big exception, which is Belgium. Now, no one knows what the heck is going on with Belgium. I mean, these guys, they're richer, and they're less happy than they used to be, but just about every other European economy has gotten richer through time. So there is a deep puzzle here, what's going on with Belgium. But by the same token, when I look at this and I'm asked to score it, does rising income make you happier? I see 8 out of 9 countries say yes. And the claim is not that income's the only thing that matters. And so there's a whole bunch of other things going on within Belgium, ethnic strife and the like. And maybe those other things are overwhelming that relationship for Belgium. That brings us to the United States. This is a much harder case. So here's average happiness in the United States. I'm showing it in the top panel here. That's the black line. And I've got data from 1972 through to the present. And you'll notice that average happiness is not increasing in the United States. And I have looked very, very hard at these data, and there's no evidence that it's rising. So the next panel shows you different measures of average income. So the green line is GDP per capita, that's a measure of average income. And the blue line is average household income taken from another survey. And the red line is average household income taken from the same survey in which I measure happiness. And that's kind of important, because if you look at the red line, income is growing, but not by very much. So that tells me the people that are answering the happiness survey, they're only getting a little bit happier through time. And they're not getting happier through time at the same rate as the rest of the economy. And I think what this tells us is, through time, it's getting harder and harder to get rich people to answer surveys. That's the only way you'd find the average income in a survey not rising as fast as it is in the economy, right? And so this survey is getting more and more of the middle class and less of the rich. Well, if you survey only the poorer people, you're surveying the less happy people. And so it could be that changing composition is part of the story. And so if surveys are not finding as many rich people, they're probably not finding as many happy people, which means that even if happiness is growing, the measures are not going to grow as fast. That's part of the answer, but it's not all of the answer. The other thing that's extraordinary about the US over the past few years, this is a chart showing you data back from 1950. It's showing you median income, so what's happening to the household that's in the middle of the income distribution. And you can see that economic growth through to and then it's showing you the 20th percentile. So this is, if you arranged all the households, those who are richer than 1/5 of all households, we call them the 20th percentile. That's shown as blue, and the red line is the 95th percentile. These are people for whom only 1 in 20 households is richer than them. So the red line is kind of rich guys, right? So what we see is, through the first 30 years of this period, all 3 grew at the same rate. So this was the rising this was the view that a rising economy lifts all boats. That everyone was getting richer through the first part, through post-war economic growth in the United States. But then remember, my happiness data start in 1972. And in 1972, from then on, the rich get a lot richer. The yellow line for the middle class goes roughly horizontal, and the blue line for the working class almost is falling. So now if you ask me, is it surprising that rising average income in the United States since the mid-70s didn't yield rising average happiness? maybe it's not so surprising because the average income rose, but the income for most households didn't. And so if most households aren't getting income gains, maybe it's not so surprising that most households aren't seeing their happiness rise. So I think the real answer to what's happening in the United States is, one answer is it's sort of embarrassing for my story because I think rising income yields rising happiness. But a different answer is we haven't had rising income for all, so maybe we shouldn't be surprised that we haven't had rising happiness for all. And so there's a distinctly American story here. Let me say a couple more things about income and happiness. This is just to show you another thing that economists obsess about is the business cycle. You know, what happens to the unemployment rate? It goes up and down, stuff like this. I was talking to one of the macroeconomics classes today, and in macro, we're all about the economy's ups and downs. And so this chart shows you the red line is a measure of the state of the economy, and I've actually drawn it upside down. And so when the unemployment goes up, the line goes down. So the red line going down is the economy going down, and the blue line shows you average happiness in the United States. And so I think one thing you can see is these two look like they move up and down together. Another way of saying that is during periods of high unemployment, it looks like happiness falls enormously. So most of the ups and downs of happiness within the United States are actually explained by the ups and downs of unemployment. Okay. So what I've done so far is I've been showing you all the data on income and happiness. But actually one of the most interesting and exciting things going on in this field is our understanding of not just happiness, but a whole bunch of different affective states is exploding. And it's exploding because we have new data. And so the data I've been showing you, people have been asked, like, how satisfied are you with your life overall? So what about how they feel more in the short term? So in this chart, what I have now is a question when we ask people, did you experience the following for a lot of the day yesterday? Did you experience enjoyment? And so each dot shows you the proportion of the population who say they experienced enjoyment for a lot of the day yesterday. And the horizontal axis again is average income, again on a log scale. So to make things easier, because I know in America we're totally obsessed with the United States, I've drawn the US in red so you can pick out your favorite country. I have not put Australia in red. I should have. And if you squint at the right angle, you can see actually you see a less clear relationship, but it is there. Those countries with higher average incomes, people are more likely to say that they experienced enjoyment for a lot of the day yesterday. Enjoyment's interesting, but what about depression? So this is sort of the opposite case. Now, think about the problem of trying to measure depression. If you tried to measure depression, for instance, by prescriptions for antidepressant drugs, you would probably conclude that Manhattan was the most depressed place on earth, right? And that Woody Allen was the most depressed guy on earth. And so you would conclude that the richest parts of the world were the most depressed. But that would be a bad way forward, because one of the reasons that people in the third world don't take antidepressant medications is because they can't afford them. So a different approach is just to ask people, did you experience depression for much of the day yesterday? And it turns out those of us in the rich world are less likely to experience depression on any given day than people in the developing world. Did you experience stress for much of the day yesterday? So the relationship here is a little weaker, but if you think that the US is a pretty stressful place, it looks like it actually is. So economic development does not get rid of stress. And then if anyone here is from the Philippines, like, what the hell? Like, it's kind of beautiful. There's no reason to stress. But they're like the most stressed people in the world, or they tell us they're the most stressed people in the world. I think this one's great. Did you have good tasting food to eat yesterday, right? And so, a lot of people are like, oh, all that matters is expectations. How are we doing to what you expect? But even on a question like this, those of us in the rich world who get to eat all sorts of delightful and delicious things turn out that we think we have delicious tasting food quite often. People in the poor world who are barely eating and barely able to get by understand that, one of the costs is they're not eating delicious food. And so we do, in fact, get to eat delicious food. I think the great miracle here is that if you look closely, the US is awfully close to France. In one country, cheese is orange, and in the other, it's delicious. So that's very confusing to me, but it seems that Americans must like orange cheese, I guess. I love this question. Did you smile or laugh a lot yesterday? So we have data from 500,000 people telling us about how often they smile. And it turns out that people from the rich world smile more often than people from the poor world. Would you like to have more days just like yesterday? There's not much of a relationship here, but to the extent that it exists, it looks like people in rich countries would really like yesterday more often than people from poor countries. It's kind of interesting. Were you treated with respect yesterday? And one of the great things that we get from economic development is we get to have jobs and roles where we feel that we're treated with respect. And people in the developed world, rich countries, we are much more likely to feel that we were treated with respect yesterday. I don't really know what to make of this, but we asked people, did you experience anger yesterday? And the answer is yes in a bunch of countries, and it's no in a bunch of countries. There's not a real strong relationship here. Fortunately, the US looks like we're relatively less angry. And maybe I shouldn't be surprised that Iran is the angriest country in the world. Were you bored yesterday? Turns out that people are bored at all levels of economic development, both rich and poor. Were you sad yesterday? Turns out that that's not closely related to economics either. So when I said that economics is closely related to happiness, that's true, but it turns out we're not closely related to sadness. Did you worry for much of the day yesterday? Not much of a relationship. Were you proud of something you did yesterday? Americans are fairly proud, it turns out, but not much of a relationship here. Did you feel well rested yesterday? I think this is kind of interesting. So those of us in the rich world who don't typically do back-breaking manual labor are much more likely to feel well rested each day. Did you learn or do something interesting yesterday? And I hope your answer tomorrow will be yes. Not much of a relationship with economic development. This is kind of interesting. Did you experience physical pain yesterday? So, at a conference like this where we spend a lot of time talking about happiness, that's all well and good, and people are really excited about it, but actually it turns out politically happiness doesn't resonate as much. If you talk to people about the importance of increasing happiness versus the importance of decreasing pain, lots of people are not so sure that happiness is so important. It's such a fuzzy concept, who cares? But basically everyone agrees that that pain is a bad thing. And it turns out that rich countries, you're much less likely to experience pain, and again, given the lives we lead of often white-collar work, that shouldn't be surprising. And then this is the graph that will make my career. Did you experience love yesterday? So first of all, the good news, you have an economist talking about love. We have data on love. And this is one of those cases where if you're doing a statistics class and you have to learn the higher order statistics and the really complicated nonlinear fits, this is a case where you really need to look hard to find the nonlinear fit, because if you stare really closely at this graph and you can look at a relationship that's allowed to curve and wobble a little, you can find a very powerful relationship right there in the data. So let me stop there, and I'd be delighted to continue the conversation with further questions. Yeah.
How do you believe equality affects a country's happiness?
The question was, how do I believe equality affects people's happiness? So let me give you a couple of answers. Remember this graph? It shows how happy people are at each level of income. And it shows each extra dollar buys less happiness the richer you get. So it looks like if this graph were true, I could take $10,000 away from a really rich American, and they'll move from being a 7.8 to a 7.7. And I could give that $10,000 to someone in Ethiopia, that's the bottom line, and they will move from a 3.5 out of 10 to a 4.5 out of 10. So that seems like I'm going to cost someone a 0.1, I'm going to buy a whole point in return. So that seems like redistribution is a really good deal. And actually, it's not even that I have to go to Ethiopia to give it, right? I could take it from someone who's earning 120,000, and if I give it to an American who's earning 20,000, it's going to move them from about 6.5 out of 10 to about 7 out of 10. So this says that redistribution from rich to poor, if it can be done effectively, would increase overall happiness. So I suspect that greater quality yields greater happiness. Now, the other thing I should say on this is, remember the puzzle? The one puzzle is why hasn't the US gotten happier through time? Why hasn't the US gotten happier since 1972? It's one of the few industrialized countries not to have. Since 1972, the US has seen an explosion in inequality, an enormous rise in inequality. And so maybe that's not a coincidence. Maybe it is in fact the case that rising inequality undermines well-being. So the question you've asked is one that I appreciate and like because it's what I'm writing about next. So hopefully stay tuned and I'll have 30 pages so boring you'll never want to read them. Yeah.
You talked a lot about differences between rich and poor, but I'm wondering, there was one of the slides where you had the 8 really wealthy people. I
Yeah.
think it was the next slide.
Yeah, it was. You heck of a memory.
Yeah, so I guess I'm really curious about this because I think the comparison between rich and poor is pretty clear. But if you look at some of the bumps through the middle,
Yeah.
so a counter argument could be why isn't that gradient actually steeper?
Right.
Sure, if you compare rich and poor.
Right.
But what about through the middle?
Yeah. So in fact, let's take a specific example. You see that in this survey, people earning $40,000 to $50,000, 46% of them are happy, very happy, but the lower income level, 55% are. So that relationship doesn't look so strong. Here's where we want to be careful not to overinterpret the data. I've only got 1,000 people, and so 1,000 people is not a very precise way of measuring what's going on. So that's why what I want to do instead is direct you back to this line. Because these lines are actually based on more data, and so therefore they're more statistically reliable. And so for each of these countries, and you can pick out the US for sure, but in each of these countries, now that it looks pretty clear that at just about every income level, the line is going up, and it's going up pretty much in a straight line. It's not quite a straight line, because again, I don't have infinite data. It wiggles a little, because my computer likes to wiggle, but basically, rising income throughout the income distribution seems to yield the same bump in well-being. So when I say comparisons of rich and poor, that was more for rhetorical effect. When I look at this graph, I think you see that the rich are happier than the middle, than are happier than the poor, and I say that that's true in roughly equal measure in every country around the world. And it's just that I have more data here, so I can speak more clearly. Yeah.
When you're talking about the women and the men thing,
Yeah.
one of the main things that has changed is there's a lot more splitting of households, where the women end up being, a lot of times single parents or virtually single parents.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, there's a lot more education for women.
Mhm.
We're now, we know and understand more how much more of a disparity there is. Whereas before, since there was a lot of role sectioning going on,
Mm-hmm.
then we were happy with our role.
Yes. So let me briefly repeat the question. So the question was going back to this, what's this puzzle? Why is it that American women aren't getting happier through time? One part of the answer may be changing family structure, that women are often single mums home by themselves, and then the other is they're actually now exposed to more. So let me take those two hypotheses in turn. So the first argument you made was, there are now more single mums, they're often at home by themselves, things like that, changing family structure. I love that question because now I get to talk about another one of my research agendas, which is about the changing American family. Here's the fact that no one knows. The divorce rate has been falling in the United States for 37 years. You'll read in every newspaper around the country, except the New York Times, that the divorce rate's rising in this rising change in this time of incredible family tumult, the American family is falling apart. In fact, 1978 was the peak of the divorce rate in the United States, and it's been falling every single year ever since. That people married in the 80s, their marriages have survived longer than people married in the 70s at the equivalent point. People married in the 90s, their marriages have survived longer, and people married in the 90s, their marriages have survived longer, and people who are recently married, they look to be on track for even longer marriages again. So in fact, family life is becoming more stable. Now, I shouldn't overstate that. That's among people who get married, and there's been a big decline in marriage. And the other thing I should say is there's very much a two Americas feel about this, which is highly educated upper middle class people have incredibly stable families, whereas working class families, that's much less so. they're actually just never marrying, and so there's no divorces to be had. So that's a partial answer to that. The other answer to that is your hypothesis was like, well, suggests that what we could do is look at different kinds of women and see what's happened to their happiness. And it turns out that the average happiness of single women has not risen. The average happiness of married women has not risen. The average happiness of mothers has not risen. The average happiness of non-mothers has not risen. So all of these different groups all had a very similar pattern. But then you gave a second hypothesis that I think is absolutely fascinating. You said women are now much more integrated into the workforce and the broader society. And so Claudia Golden is a very famous economist, one of the leading women economists in the country. Her interpretation of our work is exactly that. And it may well be this, that as women have entered the work, if you're sitting at home and you're meeting the next door neighbour as you both hang out, you're washing, you might sort of be okay with it. But when you're actually going into the office and you see the bastard who has the corner office and it should be yours, you might be kind of cranky about it. And so Claudia's interpretation of this is the end of a sort of false consciousness, and this is just an understanding of how society's been. It's hard to say that story is definitely right or definitely wrong, but it's certainly one that's consistent with the facts. Yeah.
So what I'm getting from this, according to your data, it would seem that if we get, on a global scale, if we get everyone to about like 38,000 on average, we'd be up around 8 on the satisfaction scale. But if that would be possible, wouldn't that kind of make like keeping up with the Joneses effect, and everyone would be on like a equal level? So then like there would be like no a happiness scale would just keep increasing. So like what would be like you know what I mean? Like if everyone had the same amount of money.
Wait, are you just like totally bummed that if we made everyone rich, they'll all be happy?
No, not bummed. I'm just
Okay.
saying, like it would be like it would like equal out. Everyone, the Joneses effect would occur again.
So I'm going to give you a half yes. So I'm going to use this graph instead, because if we're talking about what's happening to countries on average, we should look at what's happening to countries on average, right? And so the half in which I'm going to say yes is if everyone earned $38,000, the prediction from this theory would be everyone would have the same level of happiness. And for many people, this would be enormous, right? You'd move a whole bunch of people up from a 4 or a 5 or a 6 out of 10 up to a 7 out of 10. That'd be great. You then said that, but then what would matter is keeping up with the Joneses, and I just didn't follow that. So if we move a whole bunch of people up, they're happier. That sounds cool. No skin off my nose if people in Burundi are a 7 out of 10. So I didn't follow the second part of the implication.
I think what I was getting at was like if you move everyone up, then like there was still like we move everyone up like
Right.
What the fuck was it, like 60,000,
Yep.
20,000
Right.
at any given number. There'd still be like the bottom.
Of course.
And the top would still grow.
Yep.
Top, so it would be like a.
Do you want to be in a world where the unhappiest people are a 4 out of 10 or a 6 out of 10?
Well, yeah, repeat that.
Do you want to be in a world in which the unhappiest people in the world are a 4 out of 10, or a world in which the unhappiest people are a 6 out of 10? 6 out of 10. So that would be the miracle of economic growth. So if we can develop these countries, we're going to move it so that the unhappiest people are a 6 out of 10. No one will ever answer on one of these surveys again that they're a 4 out of 10. That would be fantastic. Now, some people worry that this will break the measures, and this might be what you're thinking about, right? So if we keep getting richer and richer, then eventually everyone's going to be a 10 out of 10, and there's nothing I can say anymore, right? Like, it'd be really boring to collect data. How happy are you? 10. What about you? 10. 10. I may as well stop collecting data. So that's a really fine concern to have. And when we get there, let's have a little party that we broke the scale. But in the meantime, realize we're actually a long way away from that. The average American is still a 7.5 out of 10. And if you want to figure out when it is we're going to break the scale, you can do that. Follow that line and keep following it until it hits the number 10, right? So we can do that. Just follow this up, and it's going to hit a 10 around about there, right? Like 6 feet over. Right, so 6 feet over, remember we're doubling income every 6 inches. Right, we're not going to move 6 feet over until we double income, until we're all, holy cow, we're rich. So we are centuries away from breaking the scale. And so that's why this is an important concern, I think, in theory, But in practice, not many people around the world are telling us that they're a 10 out of 10 yet. And so that's why I think the scale is going to keep working at least for a few more centuries. And after that, I'm dead and it's not my problem.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.